This was the beginning of the end of the largest empire in history. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which had previously been under Franco-British rule. This decision meant that the United Kingdom, which had previously managed the canal and was also the majority shareholder of the company, lost control over one of the most important communication and trade routes in the world. To prevent this from happening, London formed a secret plan with France and Israel. Israeli forces would start a war with Egypt, allowing the French and British to occupy the canal under the excuse of mediating the conflict. On October 29, 1956, the Israeli army launched an invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, and 1 week later, the Franco-British Expeditionary Corps landed in Egypt. But it didn't go according to plan. Nasser issued an order to sink the cargo ships, which blocked the canal. Former US President Dwight Eisenhower condemned the intervention. But the ailing French and British economies depended on US loans, so the two European powers were forced to withdraw in the end. And the United Kingdom's last colonial occupation thus ended in complete failure. By then, the British Empire was already beginning to dissolve. Ironically, it had reached the height of its power only 35 years earlier. In 1921, the British Empire occupied 1/5 of all emerged lands across 5 continents and ruled over 450 million people, or 1/4 of the world's population.
The important thing is to say about it is that there was never some grand plan or conspiracy on the part of the British elites to end up controlling 1/4 of the world's surface.
But how could a small kingdom on a rainy North Atlantic island become master of the world? And what is the legacy of that empire? It all began in the mid-16th century, when England was only a regional power in northwestern Europe.
Aquello que lo impulsa, en realidad, es el ver que en el siglo XVI la corona de Inglaterra se está quedando fuera del pastel que se ha abierto con la llegada de Cristóbal Colón a América. Los españoles han logrado conquistar grandes territorios que tienen gran cantidad de metales preciosos, especialmente el oro y la plata, lo que está llevando a la corona española a recibir grandes cantidades de estos metales. El Reino de Inglaterra intenta hacer algo parecido, enviando expediciones a Norteamérica.
The objective was to find territories where gold was plentiful and to locate the Northwest Passage through present-day Canada in order to trade with Asia. But those first expeditions were a fiasco.
Y ante este fracaso, la única manera de poder acceder al oro es robándolo. O sea, el primer impulso del imperio es la piratería para debilitar a la monarquía hispánica y obtener parte de ese oro que se está sacando de América. Esto se hace por medio de las patentes de corso, es decir, la corona daba permiso a los piratas para que pudiesen recalar en los puertos ingleses a cambio de compartir el botín.
Some of those pirates went on to become acclaimed admirals in the English Navy, like Sir Francis Drake, or even royal officials like Henry Morgan, who eventually became governor of Jamaica.
This was a kind of economic warfare, and that the British plundered the Spanish ships, and the Spanish plundered the French ships, and the French plundered the Portuguese ships, and as much as possible, everybody stole or interdicted each other's trade routes.
Along with piracy, another engine of English expansion used to gain power and wealth was trade.
Y aquí juega un papel especial las llamadas compañías privilegiadas, o sea, compañías privadas, que eran empresas normalmente que funcionaban por medio de un consejo de accionistas, que piden permiso a la corona para comerciar en una parte del planeta y sobre todo para obtener el monopolio del comercio en toda esa parte del planeta.
They also obtained colonial permits that cemented British imperial expansion. Between the 17th century and 1950, some 20 million people left the British Isles to settle in the empire's territories. Settlers were encouraged to take their families with them. Portuguese and Spanish migration to overseas colonies was much less extensive, and usually only men underwent the journey.
One of the big structural differences between most British colonization as opposed to Spanish and Portuguese colonization is that it was often driven by private enterprise with government support. you know? So you would have these companies established like the Virginia Bay Company, for example, that would, collect shareholders' resources, invest them in settlers, and then buy the monopoly on the goods coming out of Virginia, like tobacco, for example, from the British government, so the British government would collect a huge tax on it. The dynamics of Spanish and Portuguese colonization were very, very different.
La península ibérica siempre fue una región subpoblada. La cantidad de personas que desde la península ibérica van a Hispanoamérica a lo largo de todo el periodo de la colonia es relativamente pequeño. O sea, las estimaciones van de 100.000 a 250.000 personas. En el caso de Gran Bretaña, nunca tuvo un problema de subpoblación, sino más bien de superpoblación. Necesitaba enviar lo que se llama excedentes demográficos fuera de lo que se pretendía, en gran parte, era crear pequeñas Inglaterras en el imperio, de manera que así se podía confiar más en su lealtad y esto permitía un control del territorio mucho más seguro.
Religion and slavery in America. The first successful permanent English settlement in North America was Jamestown, which was founded in Virginia in 1607 under the command of the Virginia Company. Investors were disappointed after realizing that there weren't any gold deposits, but the settlement soon became profitable thanks to the cultivation of tobacco. In addition to trade and the migration of adventurers and disinherited people from England, Christian fundamentalism was another of the driving forces of British colonization of North America. The Puritans were unhappy with the Anglican Church's reforms. In 1620, they boarded the Mayflower to create their version of a Christian utopia under English rule. That same year, they founded the colony of Plymouth in New England, or present-day Massachusetts. The governor of Virginia, Francis Wyatt, who served from 1621 to 1625, reported that the immigrants seized indigenous land. Our first work will be to drive out the savages, to take over the whole country, to increase cattle, pigs, etc., which will be of much more use to us, for it is infinitely better not to have heathens among us.
There's nothing inherently contradictory between the ideology of Christianity and the practice of slavery. I mean, in the Bible, there's lots of slavery. And in fact, for 90% of the history of Christianity, Christians were slave owners.
European settlers prospered by importing more and more African slaves to work their North American plantations. But the most profitable colonies were in the Caribbean. In 1655, England seized the island of Jamaica from Spain, which became the most profitable sugar monoculture in the world thanks to slave labor. Between 1662 and 1807, a total of around 3.5 million African slaves arrived in North America on British ships, and those were the ones who survived. 1 in 7 enslaved Africans died on the voyage. By the end of the slave trade, England had profited more from the trade of enslaved Africans than any other colonial power. The relationship between London and its 13 North American colonies were ideal, and it lasted almost 200 years until the second half of the 18th century, when London's greed reached its breaking point.
American colonists, they were being forced to basically pay for a giant government bailout of the East India Company. It had become, in modern terms, too big to fail.
These debts also stemmed from European strife.
Cuando la corona británica, que se encuentra agotada después de la Guerra de los 7 años y tiene unas deudas gigantescas, quiere hacer pagar a las colonias norteamericanas la guerra, toma la poco prudente decisión de imponer una subida de impuestos general.
But when the colonies expressed their anger in political discourse, they were ignored. No taxation without representation was a famed slogan by revolutionary leader Samuel Adams, one of America's founding fathers. In 1776, 1 year after the American Revolution began, the United States of America declared its independence, but the new country was not recognized by London until 1783. After that, the British Crown tried to prevent similar conflicts by giving the white colonies more autonomy that would later facilitate their independence as well. Military rule and looting in Asia. At the end of the 16th century, the spice trade was the biggest business in the world. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg were produced in the Moluccas, located in Southeast Asia and India. The business returned an average of 300 and 400% on investment and attracted the interest of a group of English capitalists who founded the British East India Company in 1600. This enterprise targeted India. At the same time, the Indian subcontinent was ruled by the Mughal Empire, which extended into present-day Afghanistan and Bangladesh. It ruled over some 150 million subjects, was the richest region in the world, and the world's leading manufacturer, thanks to its coveted spices, fabrics, and jewels.
Britain, compared to, say, the Spanish or the French, which had this, grand imperial monarchy, the British really didn't have that, and the government was always small and cheap, and the British were immensely undertaxed compared to other European imperial powers. And they liked it that way, right? Because it's the elite and landholders who are going to pay most of the tax, and they're like, why would I pay money to rule India? I just want to make my profits.
The Mughal emperors allowed the East India Company to set up factories in their territory, like the Portuguese and Dutch merchants. In the 17th century, the company built forts in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, which became prosperous cities as a result. Not only did the company amass enormous wealth, but it reached a height of power unseen by any other private company in the history of mankind. In fact, 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke described the British Empire as a state disguised as a merchant. We are talking about a company that minted its own currency, had its own courts, and taxed tens of millions of people.
En poco más de 60 años pasa de ser eso, una compañía comercial, a ser un Estado dentro del Estado. De alguna manera, los gobiernos británicos se encuentran ante una situación de hechos consumados. También es cierto que gran parte de la élite de Gran Bretaña, gran parte del mundo político, no tenía ningún interés en intervenir en la compañía porque habían invertido parte de su dinero en acciones de la Compañía Británica de las Indias Orientales. Por lo que cualquier acción que pudiese llevar a que estas acciones perdiesen su valor no era deseada. Si la compañía caía, podía caer también todo el imperio.
The East India Company eventually built a private army of some 200,000 soldiers that they used to conquer most of India. It took advantage of the Mughal Empire's decline by arming Indian mercenaries known as sepoys with British guns and cannons. These troops took over the Bengal region, where the company began to operate like a state by levying taxes, which were collected mercilessly even though the population was starving. This was especially notable during a series of bad harvests in 1770.
To me, this is one of the most profound changes that the British implement in India is they say, okay, you used to have these villages that were living, and admittedly it was a kind of subsistence living. It was tough, and they were often on the margins. So it's not like the British introduced starvation, but by forcing people to grow, say, jute or tea rather than foodstuffs, this made that agricultural system much more vulnerable.
Before the arrival of the British, the Mughal emperors would use their huge grain reserves to alleviate the famines. But during the famines of 1770, the British company did nothing. Although some officials distributed food, many participated in price gouging by buying rice and selling it at 10 times the price. In addition, the company not only continued taxing locals, but they even increased them by 10% in some cases. Sepoys executed anyone who did not pay without exception. This atrocity is described in William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. The book features a direct quote from a British witness who was there. One morning from my bedroom window, I counted 40 lifeless bodies lying within 20 yards of the wall, along with many hundreds of others agonizing with hunger, writhing with their stomachs contracted to the bone. That disaster barely made a dent in the British coffers. According to recent research, it cost the lives of 1.2 million people over 2 years. But the East India Company had no remorse.
Ya a finales del siglo XVIII, la Compañía Británica de las Indias Orientales tiene bastante mala fama dentro del público general. Es entonces cuando aparece la figura de los llamados nabobs, que era más o menos como se llamaba a todos aquellos que habían trabajado para la Compañía de las Indias Orientales en la India, habían vuelto con mucho dinero, y es una figura que se solía relacionar pues, con la corrupción, con el desfalco, con la crueldad. Lo que pasa es que toda esta mala fama que obtiene la compañía no se traduce en consecuencias judiciales reales.
75 years later, a similar disaster would be repeated in Ireland, when a plague destroyed the potato crops on which the impoverished Catholic majority of the island's peasants depended.
It's the same thing with Ireland, and the potato monoculture. Is if you kind of put, engineer these vast changes to a system, you make it unstable and you make it more vulnerable.
Between 1845 and 1849, the potato blight destroyed Ireland's food system, and the British government did the same thing the East India Company had done in Bengal: nothing. 1 million Irish people died, and another million immigrated to North America. The British Secretary to the Treasury at the time, Charles Edward Trevelyan, went so far as to say, "God's judgment sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. Plague is an effective mechanism to control the population. In India, the East India Company controlled the population, and although its army was larger than the British Crown's, it did not treat the Indian soldiers as equals." Tired of being mistreated by the privileged British, the sepoys waged a rebellion in 1857, known in India as the First War of Independence.
This eventually culminates in one of the largest acts of colonial rebellion in history, which is the Indian Rebellion of 1857. And it's only after that the government says, okay, we're going to turn this into a crown colony and we're going to administer it, because this just can't go on.
In 1858, the British government took advantage of the disaster by expelling the company and seizing control of India. Afterward, the country was ruled by a viceroy appointed by the British Parliament. Queen Victoria proclaimed a new regime and declared a new law that promised equal treatment for Indian locals and British nationals, but the seed of distrust had already been sowed, and they had every reason to be skeptical because the new British viceroy once again subjected them to starvation and abandoned them. 1876 and 78, a series of bad harvests devastated the people of Madras, Bombay, Mysore, and Hyderabad. The governor of Bombay allowed a price increase for grain and reduced aid to starving people. Even employees of the empire did not have enough food. More than 5.5 million people died. The Indian population would starve again during the last years of British rule. In 1942, during the Second World War, Japan invaded Burma, which produced 15% of the grain consumed in India. Even so, authorities continued exporting the little grain it did have from Bengal to British troops fighting the Germans and Italians in North Africa. More than 2 million Indian people died during that famine, which only ended because of a record harvest at the end of 1943.
El Reino Unido, después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, ve que tiene que abandonar la India, porque ya no es viable mantener el dominio imperial sobre el subcontinente.
After 3.5 centuries of plunder, India declared its independence on August 15, 1947. 2 months earlier, Viscount Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India, announced the partition of its territories into 2 countries, Pakistan and India. Human and commercial exploitation in Africa. English merchants traveled to the west coast of Africa as early as the second half of the 16th century to trade with local kingdoms, but they applied the same tactics used in other regions by employing English privateers to rob Portuguese and Dutch slave, gold, and ivory traders. In 1681, 1 century later, the Royal African Company began transporting African slaves to North America and went on to transport more slaves during the transatlantic trade than any other company.
It's really only when you have the introduction of wide-scale African chattel slavery that the history of what we would call racism, the idea that there are races and that they have certain intrinsic characteristics, inferior or superior to other races, it's really only in that later period that racism becomes central to the institution of slavery.
But during the early 19th century, Europe's presence in Africa was limited to a few trading posts scattered along the coast along with a few Dutch settlers in present-day South Africa. But it was a Scottish scientist and adventurer, not a trader, who went on to become one of the most famous Britons in history by opening the African continent. David Livingstone was a physician, motivated by Christianity and abolitionist activism. And he embarked on several expeditions to the heart of Africa, but rather than fighting and evangelizing on the evils of slavery, he journeyed to territories previously unexplored by Europeans. Those trips attracted the interest of the West. At the Berlin Conference of 1885, the European powers divided up the African continent, allowing the British Empire to continue its expansion there. In 1869, the Suez Canal was inaugurated and soon became an essential route for communications between London and the Asian colonies. In 1875, the British state bought a large part of the shares of the canal to control it. Then it invaded Egypt in 1882, eventually turning it into a protectorate in 1914. British officials declared that the occupation would be temporary, but they promised to leave more than 60 times over 40 years, staying in Egypt and continuing its expansion south. At the southernmost tip of Africa, the driving force behind British expansion was businessman and politician Cecil Rhodes, an unscrupulous individual with virulently racist beliefs. By making pacts with locals that he then broke, Rhodes obtained mining permits and enforced his rule using his company's personal army. Then he moved north to persuade the British government to establish protectorates in the lands he controlled. As a parliamentarian and prime minister of the Cape Colony, or present-day South Africa, Rhodes enacted laws to further colonization. His dream was to create territorial continuity between Cairo and the Cape Colony by uniting them. The British government's imperial dreams exacted an enormous toll in blood and suffering during the Boer Wars. At the beginning of the 19th century, London seized the Cape Colony from the Netherlands. This forced Dutch settlers in South Africa, the Boers, to move inland where they created their own independent states. London waged 2 wars to incorporate them into the British Empire. The Second Boer War, which was fought between 1899 and 1902, was the bloodiest and most definitive of the two. Faced with fierce resistance from the Afrikaner peasants, the British drove their women, children, and elderly into concentration camps, killing almost 30,000 people, 22,000 of whom were children.
The incredible levels of suffering and misery that were inflicted upon both Boer and African civilians, that didn't come out until later. That was actually revealed by a press campaign because British papers sent 2 reporters, Emily Hobhouse and J.E. Hobson, to investigate these stories. And it's them, Emily Hobhouse in particular, that came back with those shocking photos of these emaciated children.
One of these photos was taken of a child named Lizzie Van Zyl in 1901. We will not display the full image because her starved condition could be visually disturbing to some viewers. The British also placed a large portion of the Black African population into concentration camps, resulting in the same fatal consequences.
The part of the story that often doesn't get told, though, is that significantly more Africans died in those concentration camps than white Boer civilians did, because at the time, Black lives really did not matter.
Expansion into Africa accelerated after World War I, when France and the United Kingdom divided Germany's African colonies between them. London acquired Kenya, allowing them to establish direct territorial communication between Cairo and the Cape, fulfilling Cecil Rhodes' dream. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British became the greatest beneficiary in the scramble for Africa, with 30% of Africa's population under their rule.
But for example, in their efforts, to colonize parts of the African continent, they certainly didn't recognize the political legitimacy of most of the groups, the indigenous groups they encountered. Same thing in Australia.
This resulted in new incidents of extreme cruelty. Between 1952 and 1960, British soldiers suppressed the Mau Mau guerrilla insurrection waged by the Kikuyu tribe of Kenya. Rebels were captured and tortured with multiple documented accounts of castration and rape. More than 100,000 suspects and sympathizers were forced into concentration camps. Subsequent investigations have revealed more than 1,000 people were executed without due process. A more recent example of British colonial autocracy was the expulsion of the Chagosians, who were deported from Diego Garcia Island between 1967 and 1973. Chagosians were also descended from Black African slaves who during the 18th century had been brought to the Chagos archipelago by the French. They were still living there when Washington became interested in the islands because of their strategic location in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So, US authorities requested permission from the United Kingdom to build a joint base on Diego Garcia Island. London agreed, deporting the entire civilian population, which was forcibly transferred to the Seychelles and Mauritius. And the Chagosians were abandoned at the ports without any aid and forced to live there under miserable conditions. The Chagosians were not offered reparations until the 1970s. From the time of their arrival in the 16th century and throughout the wave of independence campaigns waged during the 20th century, the British Empire left a trail of destruction and death on the African continent. Racism and banishment in Oceania. As the furthest continent from the United Kingdom, the first British fleet did not arrive in Oceania until 1788, bringing more than 600 convicts to Australia. The empire could no longer transport criminals to the United States because Britain finally recognized its independence 5 years earlier. Australia became the new British prison at the end of the 18th century, becoming home to some 120,000 men and 25,000 women. Some were convicted murderers, but others were convicted of minor offenses like theft of clothing or farm animals. Tens of thousands of colonizers organized themselves into settlements to occupy Aboriginal hunting grounds. White settlers spread throughout Australia. Clashes with Aboriginal nations on the continent were especially bloody. When they were driven from their hunting grounds, Indigenous communities resisted and were massacred by the colonizers. At the beginning of the 19th century, all this gave rise to a state of undeclared war. In 1828, British colonial rule imposed martial law in the state of Tasmania. The army was authorized to arrest any Aboriginal person in the segregated white area and instructed to kill anyone who resisted. Patrols were organized to capture adults and children, creating a human chain that swept across the island to trap Indigenous people on the peninsula. In 1835, living conditions for Aboriginal Tasmanians who had been forced off the mainland had significantly deteriorated, and the 220 who remained on nearby Flinders Island died within 14 years. Shortly after, the British Empire seized control of New Zealand in 1840. Colonization there also led to major conflict with the Maori, which ended in the confiscation of their lands. After the glory, decadence. The British Empire reached its peak at the end of the 19th century. It had led the first industrial revolution, but the world was changing, and as the second industrial revolution arrived, other countries like Germany and the United States began to challenge its global dominance.
Otro paso más hacia la crisis del Imperio Británico fue la Primera Guerra Mundial, que fue un absoluto descalabro para el Imperio Británico y para todos los participantes en la guerra, porque nunca jamás una guerra había sido tan costosa ni tan cara, ni había obligado a una movilización de la economía tan general para ganar el conflicto bélico.
After the war, the United Kingdom was significantly weakened economically, and the country's debts were aggravated by the 1929 stock market crash, making it increasingly difficult to maintain colonies that usually consumed more money than they earned. At the same time, the British government encouraged its white colonies, namely Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, to become autonomous, essentially becoming independent countries by mutual agreement. This courtesy was not extended to non-white territories, whose total control London sought to maintain at all cost, until the Second World War, which changed everything.
El británico, al entrar en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, que es todavía más cara que la Primera Guerra Mundial, enseguida tiene que recurrir a los préstamos estadounidenses para poder mantener el esfuerzo bélico contra la Alemania nazi. Esto significa que cuando en 1945 por fin se alcanza la victoria, el Imperio Británico está completamente hipotecado y de hecho durante la guerra ha perdido su papel o su posición como primera potencia y se encuentra por debajo de Estados Unidos y de la Unión Soviética.
The last British colonial campaign, the failed attempt to preserve the Suez Canal in 1956, accelerated a decline that would become unstoppable. What's left?
Oh, I would say that 95% of the historians of the British Empire are very critical of the legacy of the British Empire. I mean, we mostly look at it from the perspective of a fairly oppressive entity that was driven forward by racial ideology. Even the gentlest of these criticisms is that it was in theory a paternalist system. That is to say, where the administrators were trying to do what they thought was for the good of everybody in any particular region, by advancing it economically. And the British never would have implemented any of those policies if they didn't know it was to their immense economic advantage to do so.
The truth is that while deserting their colonies in Africa and Asia, the British left behind more chaos than welfare. They drew straight borders on the map without considering the natural and ethnic limits of each territory.
Hay que remontarse a la Primera Guerra Mundial, cuando el Reino Unido, junto con Francia y el resto de países aliados, se estaba enfrentando a las potencias del eje. El Reino Unido trataba de sacar del conflicto al Imperio Otomano, que controlaba todas las regiones, o la mayoría de las regiones árabes. Con la intención precisamente de neutralizar al Imperio Otomano, el Reino Unido se reúne con el jerife de la Meca, prometiéndole que después de la guerra, si los árabes se levantan contra los otomanos, se les concederá la independencia de acuerdo con los términos que los árabes decidan. Efectivamente, los árabes iniciaron una guerra de guerrillas muy exitosa. El problema es que al mismo tiempo el gobierno británico había contactado con líderes sionistas y el conjunto de las negociaciones con estos líderes sionistas habían dado lugar a lo que se llamó la Declaración de Balfour, por la cual el gobierno británico se comprometía a apoyar y a respaldar lo que llamó en el documento un hogar nacional para el pueblo judío en Palestina. Este doble juego resulta especialmente hipócrita porque entre las negociaciones con los árabes y la Declaración de Balfour en 1917, el Reino Unido ya había decidido lo que quería hacer con los territorios árabes y era repartírselos con Francia.
Britain was, along with France, they were the power that was most involved in the partition of the Middle East into nations that did not correspond with the cultural and political patterns that were already existent. I mean, part of the boundaries of Syria were created by an American politician who only had his position because he had made a huge contribution to the previous presidential campaign. I mean, the man sold toilets. Like, he had no right to redraw the map of the Middle East.
The partition between India and Pakistan was just as arbitrary.
Esas fronteras las va a trazar un abogado británico que se llamaba Cyril Radcliffe, que no era experto en cartografía, que jamás había estado en la India y que solo tuvo 5 semanas para trazar las fronteras, de acuerdo con censos antiguos y mapas antiguos.
Nearly a century later, and no longer under British rule, many of these borders are still a source of conflict. The remains today of this once great empire include distant colonies, like the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar, whose rule is also claimed by Argentina and Spain, respectively. The British Empire's legacy also features the promotion of parliamentarism across 5 continents, and English as the lingua franca in every corner of the planet, which has shaped much of the world.
El imperio británico, como el resto de los imperios, se construyó por medio de atrocidades, pero también generó toda una serie de transformaciones que han moldeado el mundo en que vivimos hoy en día.